Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Yanni, Superintendent of Schools, and it's my pleasure to be here with our Chief Financial Officer, Andy Lechman, tonight to present this virtual town hall. Previously, we shared an agenda, and that agenda is really the presentation. We're going to walk through the finances of the district, looking at our preliminary or our I should say proposed budget. We'll be answering questions throughout the event. A number of questions have been pre-submitted, so when it's appropriate, we'll bring those up. You all have access as attendees to the question and answer feature, so if you have any questions along the way, please type those questions in and we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can tonight. This event is being recorded and the link will be shared next week in the Touch Base Tuesday, but I anticipate that the recording of this event will be up on our district's YouTube channel well in advance of that. So tonight, taking a look at our town hall objectives is really looking at the development of the 21-22 school year. And really, as we talk tonight, the development of a budget is really ongoing. So as soon as we passed the budget that we're currently in for the 2021 school year, work on the 21-22 budget began. We want all of you walking away tonight to have an understanding of a few big topics or areas of the budget. So we want everyone to understand the budget development process and what our budget priorities are. We want everyone to know and understand what our revenue sources are and the parameters that we have to work within, which is the Act 1 index. We're going to give you some information on the major expenditures, especially those that are increasing and recurring year after year. We'll talk a little bit about the Capital Reserve Fund and planning for capital expenditures. That's, renovating our buildings, maintenance on our buildings, making sure that our buildings remain in good shape for our students in our community. And then finally, we will talk about some of the unknowns that we're facing. The challenge every year is school districts are really building budgets without knowing exactly the funds that they're getting from the state and from the federal level. This year, we also have a couple additional challenges. We don't know yet what the American Rescue Plan, how that's going to completely impact us and what all the parameters of those funds will be. But these are the objectives that I think will become pretty clear as we go through. Mr. Lechman is going to do a lot of the talking tonight, and then I'll be chiming in with questions and some additional information. 2 years ago, we took our district's comprehensive plan and we created a set of strategic action plans. And we have articulated a number of goals, and those goals set the context for our budget. So we want to construct, approve, and implement an educationally and fiscally sound budget. We want to be able to remove barriers and provide access for all of our students into rigorous courses and educational offerings, while also being sensitive to our community, our tax base. We want to ensure transparency to increase communication and foster trust. One of the things that I think our district can be very proud of is, as we've been going through the budget process, Mr. Lechman has been as transparent as possible as we're discussing the major functions of our budget. We want to ensure a quality education for our kids. So, we have some of these strategic action plan goals, looking at making sure that we have 100% of our kids reading on or above grade level by the end of grade 3. That we have 100% of our kids at least proficient in math by the end of grade 7, and 100% of our kids proficient across writing domains by the end of 8th grade, because we know those are benchmarks that if we are successful on those benchmarks with our kids will continue to be successful moving forward, not just while they're with us K-12, but once they leave and they choose to go on to college or career. We want to incorporate technology that is meaningful. This past year, as we've navigated the pandemic, there has been a large increase in screen time, and there's been an increase in the devices and the programs and the software that we've been using. And we want to be really thoughtful about what it is that we continue using. we've talked a lot about a needs-based budgeting philosophy. So, back years ago, and myself included as a former principal, we would build our budgets by looking at whatever we spent one year, adding a percentage to it, and not really taking a look at what it is that I need to run my buildings in terms of staff, in terms of supplies, all those things that come together to form our budget. So we have been employing now for the third year a needs-based budget philosophy, and that has allowed us to be very deliberative and very intentional about funds that we're putting in the budget or that we're earmarking in the budget and what we're actually purchasing inside our budget. We want to attract, hire, and retain a highly qualified staff that's reflective of our student community. It's no surprise to anyone that we're in a period where we're starting to see shortages of potential applicants and potential candidates for jobs. And those challenges are starting to hit the suburbs much more quickly than anyone had anticipated. So we want to be able to route as much money as we can into classrooms and be able to attract, hire, and retain really good candidates for the positions that we have open for our kids. We want to be able to fund capital projects. We have a beautiful high school. We'll have a new middle school. We have a relatively new elementary school, but we have 3 aging elementary schools, 3 elementary schools that are going to need a varying amount of work. We've just completed a facility condition assessment, and that lays out about $40 million worth of work that needs to be done over the next 10 to 20 years. So we want to be able to have capacity inside our budget to be able to put money aside so that we could do capital projects and do preventative maintenance on our buildings so that we keep our facilities in good shape. And we also want to engage the community. We realize that doing a singular town hall isn't the be all end all, but this is really one more step that we'll take to engage the community and look forward to doing more of these next year, not just around budget, but around a number of topics, and do them in person, these town halls in person. Next slide, Mr. Leichman. Mr. Leichman, would you like to take it from here?
Sure, I can take it from here. So this is a look at our timeline of the budget the budget process that we go through. And as Dr. Yanni mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we start the budget process almost immediately after the board approves it in June. So you see in September, we're already kicking off our timeline and working through some things like assumptions and projection models, multi-year projection models. Where we're at right now at the time we're doing this presentation for the town hall is we sort of just wrapped up March and April here, where we gave detailed presentations to the finance committee to look at revenue budget in March, and we looked at the expense budget in April. And now we're finishing up with staffing models, and on May 13th, which will be our next finance committee meeting, we'll give an update on our proposed final budget, and then in June approve a final budget. So this is sort of a culmination of the March and April presentations on revenue and expense that we gave. So this will kind of be all of that put together. So that's our timeline that we'll go through. And then tonight, basically what I'll cover here is the highlights of our budget, the major areas of our budget for the 21-22 fiscal year. And basically where I'll start at here is at the very highest level is two numbers, $108,876,000 and $107,713,000. And what those two numbers represent are in the 21-22 budget, the top number is the cost or the projected cost to run the school district in the 21-22 school year. And the bottom number is the revenue available to fund those expenses for next year. So when you think about that, what you see is the difference between those two numbers. What we call our structural deficit is about $1,162,753, meaning that projected expenses are more than the projected revenues that we have available. And while that may seem like a large amount, it's actually less than 1% of the overall budget. So yes, our goal is to eventually achieve a balanced budget where revenues match expenditures. Right now, we are working towards that, and we're getting a little closer to that each year. Some options that we have available. So a school district is required to balance the budget every year. But the way that we do that is we're using fund balance or our savings account to basically close that gap right now. Some other options that we have are we could increase revenues, but we only have the ability to do that to a certain point. We can decrease expenditures by $1,162,000 to balance. But the most likely plan that we'll close this year with is some combination of all three of that as we work towards a final budget.
And Andy, if I could just jump in here for a second. I don't want anyone walking away reading that slide saying that we're going to cut staff or we're going to cut programs. No, there are no program cuts planned for the upcoming school year. So the programs and the instructional, our instructional core is not affected next year by removing or curtailing any program in the district.
So the next question we need to ask ourselves is, do we have enough fund balance to close that gap? So you can see here, we currently have a fund balance that's $4,610,000 available to us. So the answer is yes. So right now we are in a financially sound situation. But fund balance is something that must be managed very carefully, as this is essentially our district savings account. It's unsustainable to fund a growing deficit with fund balance because eventually the savings will run out. So ideally, what we would want to use fund balance on would be for one-time expenses and things like that, so we don't eventually run out, but we use it strategically over time to balance our budget. And we also have board policy that sets a guideline for us to maintain fund balance between 5 and 8% of district expenditures. So we have to be mindful of that as well. So, and we must continue to manage the growing gap between revenues and expenses to bring these numbers back in line. So what you see here, hopefully that's not cut off there, but what you see here at the top is this chart provides a clear picture of how quickly fund balance would be depleted if expenses are allowed to continue to trend upward at the current rate of increase per the blue line there is the expense increases. And if property tax increases were held at 0% and revenue remained flat per the orange line there. So the gap you see would grow to over $12 million by the 24-25 years. So that's not a sustainable model. You know, often we're asked the question of, well, taxes increase every year, and this sort of explains why. And you'll see that more as we move through the presentation.
But I think to that point, and if I could just, I'm sorry to jump in, you know, while we have tax increases, that doesn't mean that we are taking that notion lightly. So over the last number of years, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the trend has been that the tax increases have been below the Act 1 index. So when you think about the Act 1 index this year being 3%, by the time we get to the final budget, Andy and I will not be recommending to the board a full tax increase, because we want, again, to have an educationally sound budget, but also a budget that is respectful to our community and our tax base.
So now I'm going to move into the expense side of the budget and talk about some of the major budget expenditures to explain the upward trend of that blue line in a little bit greater detail. So district expenses are increasing at a rate of about 2.8% per year, and those increases are being driven by two main areas. The personnel costs account for about 75% of district expenditures. As you can imagine, education is a personnel-heavy industry. We're driven by personnel being in buildings, supporting students, and providing instruction and services to students. So with personnel costs come recurring and increasing expenditures related to, we have collective bargaining agreements with our two main labor groups, which are UDEA, the professional union, and UDSD, which is our support staff union. We have medical benefits that continue to go up at an ever increasing rate. You know, the outward trend is 8% per year. And we have a mandated state pension system, which I will talk much more about, which continues to increase over time. And you'll see some of those numbers in this presentation. Debt service makes up about 11% of our expenditures and is increasing by about $1.8 million from this budget year that we're in, the 2021 year, to 22-23, and then it levels off. And debt service is related to the construction of Sandy Run, the Sandy Run Middle School. And all other are 14% of district-related expenses. And this is where, as Dr. Yanni mentioned, our needs-based budget process is controlling costs in the areas that we can control costs. But when you look into that, and you'll see on the next slide, one area that's increasing substantially is the cost of charter school tuitions, which is projected to be at this time up over $900,000 for next year. So I do realize this slide is a little tough to read, but it does provide a comparison of budget increases from the current year to the 2021 budget year. And what you can see here is, if you look at the bottom, you can see that our budget, the expenditures are increasing by approximately $4.4 million. And where that's coming from, again, all these main areas, but about $2 million of that is personnel related, so wages and benefits. 900,000 of that is related to charter school tuitions, and 1.5 million of that is related to debt service and the transfer to the capital reserve, all of which I will talk about in more detail as we move through this presentation. So before going further, the one thing I want to start with is this all other category. And again, I group it that way because, again, we're talking about major components of our budget. So salaries and benefits are major components. And then all other makes up about $15.9 million or 14% of the budget. And I start here because I think a lot of people think this is an easy place to go. You need to save $1 million, go to the all other, cut $1 million out of all other category. But all other, it's important to note, all other does not mean discretionary. So you can see we utilize a needs-based budget philosophy, and that creates conversations aimed at controlling these expenses. But within this category, you see many items that are not fully within our control, like cyber charter tuitions, the tuition calculation specifically, special education tuitions and other costs, students attending Eastern Center for Arts and Technology, legal, insurance, utilities, all these things we do have control over to manage, but they're not areas where we can just go cut, electric and heating costs and save $940,000. So this slide is a look at the PSERS state pension system. So a major expense that we report as benefits is PSERS, which is our mandated state pension system. And I say mandated because it's a system that school districts have no control over and we're required to participate in. So what you're seeing here is this is the employer rate. This is the rate that all employers across the state pay into the system at. So the rate for 21-22 is 34.94%. And what that really means is for every $100 in wages, we must contribute $34.94 into the system. So the rate you can see is projected to increase to over 38% out in the 27-28 school year. And that's increased from 5.64% only 10 years ago. So what does this mean in terms of real expenses? So this slide looks at the blue line. What you can see are the actual payments that we make into the PSERS system. So for the 21-22 year, based on current salaries and staffing levels, we will have expenditures of over $17 million that we'll pay into the system on a $108 million budget. And that's increased from $8 million in just a couple of years ago here. So the state also does provide a revenue source to each district as a reimbursement for half of the employer cost of PSERS, which is reflected in the orange line there. And this is the state share into the PSERS system. So you can see that the net costs are projected to be $8.7 million after we receive our reimbursement from the state. Which is an increase of over $4 million, $4.7 million from just 7 years ago. And that's all been shifted to the local tax base. Healthcare benefits is another major area of expense increases. So we actually do participate with a benefits consortium. It's the Bucks and Montgomery County Healthcare Consortium. And we're in that consortium with 10 other school entities between Bucks and Montgomery County. And what the consortium really shows us is that they use a long-term 8% trend for expenditures in the future. And they look at our current claims to basically create our district trends or increases. So the current version of the budget has a 6% placeholder, and we believe the final budget will be closer to 4%. So that's an example of an area where we're not done with the budget process at this point. So just that one change will reduce the budget by about $150,000 as we look at the proposed final budget in May. Charter school tuition costs are another significant area. And I want to start by saying I believe just from things that I've heard, that there may be a misunderstanding that school districts are opposed to charter schools. And that is not accurate. So what school districts are opposed to are how charter schools are funded and the funding calculation. And I think on the main page of our website, you can see Dr. Yanni put together some great information about charter schools and tuitions and how they're funded and calculated. So please go check that out as another resource to review this. So charter schools actually advertise their programs as no cost or tuition free. And what that actually means is, yes, to the parents, they do not pay tuition to the charter school. What happens is each school district pays the charter school for each student that would be enrolled with the district that enrolls with a charter or a cyber charter school. The tuition rate is based on a state mandated calculation, and it's the same for brick and mortar as it is for cyber charter schools. And you can see our current rates there. For regular education, it's $17,750. And for a student that is in a charter school that has an individualized education plan, is special education services for $38,000. And that's regardless of the type of services that student might be receiving. It's just a flat rate for any student with an IEP. So during the pandemic, enrollments in cyber charter schools increased significantly as they did across the state. And we've seen enrollment increase from 13 to 55, and costs increased from about $365,000 to almost $1.3 million. And all of our enrollments are in cyber charter schools. So we're closely monitoring this for 21-22, and we're already starting to see students re-enroll with the district. So this is another area where we should see numbers start to decrease. But again, we will not actually reduce it from our budget until we receive the actual enrollment back into the district.
And Andy, I just want to add just a couple points here. So when we look at enrollment in cyber charters increasing so dramatically, that is, there's a direct correlation there. When we began the year virtually, there were many families that decided to go to cyber charters because they believed that cyber charters would be more adept at delivering virtual programming. What I want everyone on the call tonight to hear is we are not blaming families at all. As Mr. Leckman said, we are not opposed to families and parents choosing options for their students. We've been talking about internally cyber charter school funding formulas for a long time, well in advance of the pandemic. But as Mr. Leckman said, we are seeing a number of students coming back and re-enrolling for next year. There was a question asked at one of our previous committee meetings, have we asked families why they left? And if they're not going to come back to us, are we asking why they're staying? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. So our principals have been in touch with all of the families that the students would have been in their schools to have those conversations. And we're not actually reducing the line item in our budget for cyber charters until students actually re-enroll back in the district. So we're being very cautious with this. We don't want to assume all 55 are going to come back, or the vast majority of that 55 coming back, and reduce the budget right now. We will reduce that line item in the budget as they re-enroll. And through Finance Committee and other communications, we'll make sure that the community knows how much we're reducing that by. But I truly don't want anyone to think that we are blaming families, blaming students for going to cyber charter schools. That's not the case.
So debt service, the next two slides are debt service and our capital reserve fund. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because it can get a little complicated to cover in just a couple of minutes. But debt service is simply the annual payments that we are required to pay to service our debt. So this includes both the principal and interest payments for debt that we issue for capital projects, very similar to a mortgage. It's important to cover this as it relates directly to the recommended transfer to the capital reserve and the savings from the bond refunding that we did earlier this year. So borrowing began for our new Sandy Run Middle School in the 18-19 year. And as we issue debt, the amount that needs to be paid back each year increases. So from the left side of the chart, you can see that the bar begins to trend higher. The first three borrowings occurred in similar debt issues of about $10 million. So the increases were much smaller. They increased very incrementally. The fourth borrowing, which occurred in January of 2021, just a few months ago, was our largest borrowing at $40 million. And we have been projecting that the large increase in debt service payments from that borrowing would occur in the 21-22 budget. But around that same time, just a few months later, we were also working with our financial advisor to refund existing debt to achieve lower interest rates. That process was extremely successful as we were able to refinance on two separate occasions at near all-time low interest rates. These refundings generated almost $1.9 million in one-time savings, which you can see in the first orange bar here. So instead of seeing a significant increase in the 21-22 budget, we're actually seeing a slight decrease because of that savings, one-time savings. Then you move to the second orange bar, which will be in the 22-23 budget. And you see the impact of that one-time savings because now the large increase occurs in 22-23. So we must prepare for it. We can't just take that savings and cut it out of the budget because it's coming right at us next year. That's why I'm recommending that this one-time savings be saved into the capital reserve fund to fund capital project needs to reduce future borrowing costs. So then with that, the capital reserve fund so why do we need to save in a capital reserve fund, and what is the capital reserve fund? So first off, the fund is a fund designated to pay for capital projects, and we also purchase school buses out of that fund. And we currently have a little over $5 million saved in that fund. And that may seem like a lot of money, but just to put it in context, we have district facilities valued at over $220 million, which we need to maintain. And that number doesn't even take into account the new Sandy Run Middle School that's going to be coming online in the near future. So we recently had a facility condition assessment completed by a third-party consulting firm, which identified, as Dr. Yanni already mentioned, about $40 million of capital projects that need to occur over the next 10 years, with a large majority of that falling within the first 5 years, so about $30 million. So that's not set in stone. That's not our long-term capital plan yet, but just based on the work that they did, that's kind of how those numbers lay out. So while it's probably unlikely we'll be able to save $30 million in the next 5 years, the more that we can set aside now, the less we'll potentially need to borrow to do some of those projects in the future. And also the study noted that really, ideally, we should be putting about 1.5% to 3% of our portfolio replacement value aside each year, which would be about over $3 million. And that doesn't even include the Sandy Run Middle School. So they're large numbers, and we need to take steps to prepare for them.
Mr. Leckman, before we go on, there was a question typed in. Won't debt service continue to increase when the other three schools are updated? I know you have projections, but based on the Sandy Run experience, those costs will be significantly above the projections.
Well, I think so. It's a good question. And that kind of gets back into the $40 million that we're talking about here. That all of the work that's projected to be done on the other elementary schools is part of that $40 million number. So yes, if we need to issue more debt in the future to pay for that work, then yes, debt service would continue to trend higher. If we can figure out how to save enough money to not need to borrow, then no, debt service would not increase. So that's kind of why we're looking at saving money into our capital reserve fund to reduce future borrowing.
Thank you.
So lastly here, I think it's, hopefully it's clear what we're working on is going back to that blue line and that upward trend. We are really working constantly to figure out how we slow that upward momentum of expenditures. It's not just about, as Dr. Yanni mentioned, raising taxes to figure out how to fund it. We've been doing a lot of work on the expense side to figure out how to bring that blue line down to the revenue line. And these are just some of the areas that we're working on in order to achieve that. So Dr. Yanni, before I move into revenue, do you have anything else to add on the expense side?
One of the things that's reoccurring is something I said last year at a town hall, and I believe I misspoke, so I'll correct the record. When we think about our budget and we think about how much money we spend per student, I was talking about the operational side of the budget. So there's no doubt and there's no question that our debt service is high. So I just want to correct the record as we're thinking about, when we talk about per pupil expenditures. I was speaking, and we will continue to speak in terms of operational costs.
So now we'll jump into revenue here. School districts have multiple sources of revenue to fund their operations. So this gets into now the $107 million worth of revenue that we have to fund our expenditures. The main sources are grouped into three main categories. We have local revenues, we have state revenues, and we have federal revenues. Local is by far our largest revenue source at about 81%, state 18%, and federal, while it is a material number at about $1 million, it's really 1 or less than 1% of our total revenue sources. We have very little control, as do districts in general, over the majority of the sources of revenue. But the one major source of revenue that we do control is the property tax revenue, which accounts for about 73% of the total district revenues. So this chart shows the revenue trends by source and helps provide some scale to the amount of local revenue that fund the district compared to state funding. It gives you a couple years worth of trend here to see how our revenues are trending. And within the local revenue, the longer term trend is intact, but you can see there, just to note, under local, the dark blue line, that was the budget for 2021. And you can see that it dropped off because we were expecting significant revenue losses in local revenues due to the impacts of the economic impacts of COVID last year. And what really happened is when you start to look at some of the actual numbers that have come in this year, those numbers have trended very much in line with the long-term trend. So I think it's a good thing for our district and districts in this part of the state that have not seen a major impact from COVID on the revenue side. State revenues continue to trend upward at about a 1.7% increase, but you can see they're far less than our local sources. And federal revenue, you almost can't even see it on here, again, from a materiality standpoint. So this chart provides a little more detail about local revenue. You can see property tax revenues account for almost $80 million of our total $107 million revenue budget. The current version of the budget does include a property tax increase of 3%. But as Dr. Yanni mentioned, that is a placeholder only at this point and is not finalized until the board passes a final budget in June. And state revenues in total are about $20 million. So one of the questions that was pre-submitted, and this slide kind of gets to that, was asking to address the total state revenue per student for regular education and special education. And it's not quite that simple when it comes to state revenues. So I added this slide and the next slide to get into that just a little bit. While the total revenues received from the state are around $20 million, there are multiple different categories of revenue that we receive from the state. And all of them have different formulas and calculations to decide how much money each school district receives. So you can see on this slide that the largest increasing state funding source is the state share of the PSERS costs, which are the mandated increases. All other line items are, while increasing slightly some of the other line items, they're basically flat, and the major source of increase is coming from the state share of the state retirement system here. The other areas you can see, SEF is special education. Transportation is based on a complicated formula of buses on the road, how many kids are on, how many miles they run with and without students. So very complicated stuff that we really don't have time to get into this evening. But I do want to just not walk through this, but show you. This is a slide that PASBO presents. That PASBO is a state organization that supports school district operations and business offices. This is basically the calculation for how the basic education funding formula works. It's not just as simple as the state is going to contribute X amount. We divide that by the number of students each district has, and voila, you have your allocation. All of these individual factors go into calculating each school district's proportional share of the total dollar amount. And not to mention, this is based on new dollars that were added on just since this formula was added a few years ago. There's also a fixed amount that says every school, it's called hold harmless, every school district will not receive less than what they received at a point in time. And then new money will be distributed via this calculation. So it's extremely complicated, and the factors change on a year-to-year basis. So lastly, this shows state revenue compared to PSERS costs. So thinking about the information on the state revenue slides and the slides 14 and 15, which show the cost of the pension system that we have no control over. This slide really shows that when you compare total state funding revenue increases to the PSERS net expense increases over the last 6 years, you can see that $3.4 million has been shifted to the local tax base here. So while it is true that the state is providing increased funding across all of those different revenue categories we talked about, the increases are not even keeping up with what we as a school district are required to contribute to the PSERS pension system, those cost increases. So state funding falls $3.4 million short just in this one mandated cost category. So as we discussed, the property tax revenue is the primary revenue source that school districts have control over, that school districts do have control over. While the district does have control over this revenue source, it's not full control because Act 1, which was a law passed in 2006, limits the amount that school districts can increase property taxes by on an annual basis. And the way that calculation works, it's a factor of the CPI, which is basically inflation, and the statewide average weekly wage. So it looks at how inflation is increasing and how wages across the state are increasing, and it calculates a cap at what school districts are able to raise property taxes. That cap for 21-22 is 3%. And districts do have the ability to increase beyond that, but it's based on very specific calculations that PDE has set for increasing costs related to the pension system and increasing costs related to special education on a year-to-year basis. In December, though, our school board approved a resolution to not apply for any of those exceptions. So the final tax increase cannot exceed that 3% limit in next year's budget. So here you can see, and Dr. Yanni did mention this, you can see where the Act 1 index has been over the past few years. That's the blue line. And then you can see the orange line, which is the actual tax increases for the school district during that same time. And you can see for the last 4 years, the district has held increases to under the Act 1 index cap. And already we know that that cannot be exceeded for 21-22. And hopefully we'll be slightly below that for next year as we look to finalize the budget. The increases above the index, when you look back to those first 3 years on this chart, you can, if you remember back to the PSERS cost increases, 2011-12 to 2016-17 were the years of largest increases, largest jumps in the employer rate. So those increases above the index were the exceptions for the state property or the state pension system increases.
And Mr. Leckman, if I could just jump in there. One of the questions that we're often asked is, why is the employer contribution to PSERS so high? And that is for a period of time, I guess late 90s, early 2000s. Keep me honest, Andy. Is that, the way the economy was going, districts in the state did not have to make all their contributions to the pension system. So then when the economy took a turn for the worse, in the last recession, all of that ground had to be made up. So the employee contributions have remained stable over the years. But really now what's happening is districts in the state have to catch up so that the pension system is not underfunded.
That's correct. And actually the pension system is underfunded by about $40 billion right now, if I'm remembering that number correctly. So it's a huge number, and that's kind of why it continues to increase slowly now, but it plateaus at that rate for a number of years now until we start to catch up and get closer to funding that liability statewide. So property tax lingo. So before we move into the next slide, I share this just so you have a sense of there's two very different values when we talk about the value of properties, and that's market value versus assessed value. And it's important to know the difference when looking at taxes. So assessed value is basically the dollar value assigned to a property to calculate taxes. Simple as that. Market value is the actual real-time value of a property. So if you went and put your home on the market and sold it for a certain price, that would be the market value of your home. You can also get that number from doing an appraisal on your home. And those are the two differences. Assessed value in Montgomery County is approximately 1/2 of the market value. And that is different from county to county. So that's why it's very difficult to start to compare millage rates from county to county, just because of some of those differences. And then when you look at a property tax calculation example, I have this in here so you can see how it's actually calculated across. And then it compares the median assessed value home in our district, which is a little over $197,000, assessed value. Remember, different between assessed value and market value. To calculate what the total property tax bill would be on that property. And what you can see here is at a 3% increase, the annual increase would be about $209 on a property at the median property assessed value across the district. So this chart is very important to understand because, that the last chart I showed you that looked at this basically gave you an unsustainable assumption to say, well, what would it look like if we had no property tax increases? So you can see that that's not a sustainable model. This really looks at where we're really at right now based on the current 21-22 budget that we have that I just talked to you about tonight, and where projections based on assumptions that we use and talk about at our finance committee meeting on a regular basis. This chart highlights the same information. You can see the blue line is our expenses and how they're trending. The orange line is our revenues and how they're trending. And the assumption for the orange line in this model is right now it's a placeholder of 3% for 21-22, an increase of 3%. And then the future projections include a 2% increase, again, just as a placeholder to see what the future starts to look like. It's very important that we can't just look at the budget and our finances on a one-year basis, because as expenses recur and grow into the future, we need to understand how decisions that we make today impact not just this year and next year, but 3, 4, 5 years out. And you can see that while we have about a $1 million deficit right now in this year's budget, that's growing to a little over $5 million as we get out to the 24-25 year. Now, with that said, we do know that there's a number of new developments that are happening out in our community, right? Promenade, Enclave, they will bring in new revenue. So this is like a worst case scenario picture from my standpoint. But we often, again, get asked, well, you have all this new revenue coming in from new developments, how is that impacting your budget? What you can see here is that is really just helping to fill in the gap that we have over the next few years. The other thing that we know we're dealing with is that's new revenue. We're constantly dealing with residential and commercial much larger dollar values, assessment appeals, where commercial properties say, hey, I think my property is overvalued from a tax standpoint. They appeal their assessment, and then we're losing revenue on that side. So there is a net effect to that. So it's not just all new revenue coming in. And this really gives you a sense of our new developments. Again, I won't walk through all of these. I think the important piece to know is that we know we have approximately $5 million of new revenue from these new developments that will come in over time. It's not all going to show up at once. So again, these are estimated figures. We work with the township to create some of these numbers. These are in no way guaranteed, but it's our best estimate of what we expect to happen over the next few years from these new developments. And you can also see the note on here that just this year from commercial assessment appeals, we've lost about $363,000 in revenue from reduced assessments on some of these properties. So the other unique thing that's happening right now with COVID, there's been a lot of federal stimulus funding that have come into school districts across the country. And we've welcomed that funding to help, if you remember at the beginning of the year to prepare for the opening of schools, we were procuring a lot of PPE, hand sanitizers, cleaning sources. We purchased a lot of desks, things like that to spread out within our kindergarten classrooms and cafeterias. So this money definitely did help us this year and will continue to help us in the future, right? A lot of the incremental expenses we had due to COVID was able to be filled in by this stimulus money. So in total, we've been granted about 6 sources of funding from stimulus. The way that works is we have to apply submit applications, and then submit basically reimbursement requests or reporting on a regular basis to get this money. So we do not have all of this money in our bank accounts right now. It's money that will come to us over time as we spend this money. Currently, we have almost $1.9 million in funding available, and we're planning for this one-time funding. Again, critical, like we talked about with capital planning. This is, while it's great to have all this money, we have to be very careful about how we plan for it and spend it, because it will be here one time, we will spend it, and then we will never receive it again. And we don't want to make the same mistakes that school districts made in 2008, 9, and 10 when the ARRA money came in during that fiscal crisis. where school districts were kind of left in a really bad position because they brought on all these recurring recurring expenditures, and then the money ran out and the state reduced funding at the end of it. So we need to be very careful and thoughtful about how we plan for this. We're also, I will be clear, we are looking at the facility condition assessment and some of the projects that were identified in there, and potentially looking at utilizing some of this money to do capital projects that are allowable with some of these funding sources like ventilation and HVAC in buildings, because that matches up then to some of the projects that were identified in the condition assessment. So it's another source to potentially offset that $40 million number. So the last couple slides I'll cover here are just, these are from Forecast 5, which is a software that we use that helps us compare our data, analyze our data, and then do some comparisons to other. What you see here is a comparison of millage rates to other school districts. And I do realize that an easy comparison to make is millage when looking at other school districts within the same county. But as I explained before, you cannot compare millage rates between counties. There is a calculation that the state does to create some comparable number of equalized mills. But when you look at just true millage rates, that's really just within Montgomery County that you can look at that. This chart compares millage rate and shows that the current millage rate puts Upper Dublin sort of right in the middle of the surrounding districts. Again, we're on the higher side, but I note there over three mills were voter approved for the referendum to build Upper Dublin High School. So eventually, as the debt service is paid off for the high school, those 3 mills will be drawn out of our millage rate. So while we're on the high end right now, if you pull those 3 mills out, we get down very much to the middle of the pack across districts that are close in our surrounding area in Montgomery County. The one thing I do want to note, again, it's important as we flip through these slides, note Colonial, Upper Merion, and Wissahickon have the lowest millage rates on this chart here. So look what happens, and I want you to pay attention kind of in those areas as I flip to the next slide here at Colonial, Upper Merion, and Wissahickon. So Colonial, Upper Merion, and Wissahickon have significantly higher assessed values, and Colonial and Upper Merion have significant commercial assessed values when comparing to other districts in our same area, including Upper Dublin School District. So if you remember, assessed value is basically how property tax revenue is calculated. So when you look at these districts, they're off the charts higher than other local school districts here, which helps them maintain a lower millage rate because they have more assessed value to offset increased millage. Their mill, when they raise it, generates more revenue than our mill does here in Upper Dublin. So looking at millage strictly by itself, or assessed value or millage strictly by itself, doesn't tell that full story here. So again, they have the highest assessments. Well, maybe they're the largest districts by far. So if you look at this slide, what this shows you is an apples to apples comparison of assessed value based on district enrollment. So again, when you look at Wissahickon as the example compared to Upper Dublin, Wissahickon's millage is a little over 21, Upper Dublin's is over 35, but Wissahickons' assessed value per student is around $800,000 versus Upper Dublin's assessed value per student is around $550,000. So Wissahickon does not need as high of a millage rate to generate the same amount of revenue per student because they have about $250,000 more of assessed value per student. So it's just information to be aware of as we look at comparisons across district. So again, tonight was just a quick summary of everything that we have going on in our budget planning for next year, expenses and revenues. This slide is just a quick summary of everything we talked about tonight. It sort of summarizes, again, revenues, expenditures, and the planned transfer to capital reserve, and that we're looking about a $1.1 million deficit right now that we're working on closing. The final budget will be approved in June, but right now I think I'm very happy with where things stand. I feel like when we looked at it as a first pass last year, things looked a little more challenging. But as our team, our executive leadership team, has put a real focus on managing the expenses of the district in multiple areas of the district, that we've started to see the picture become a little clearer and start to become a little less dire than it was last year. So I feel like we're in a much better position than we were last year. Although, as you can see, we still have significant work to be done over the next couple of years. And the last thing I'll say here is, just as Dr. Yanni mentioned, even at this point in the budget process, we have a number of unknowns or major open items that we just don't know yet, right? So the budget is based in many areas on trends and assumptions, things we know about, things we absolutely know, but what we don't know is where the final tax increase will be. So every 0.1% reduction would be about a $75,000 reduction in revenue, creating a larger deficit. Assessment appeals, current and future, what's going to happen? Just a few years ago, our largest taxpayer, the Prudential Building, appealed their assessment, and we lost over $1 million in revenue just from that one property. So we need to keep our eye on that, and if there's a potential we could lose significant revenue in the future from these appeals. We also do know we have new development assessments, but we don't know what the actual assessments will be, the actual revenue will be, and we don't know the timing of it all. It just depends on how the properties are developed, sold, and then assessed. And we also don't know anything about state or federal funding allocations at this point. Governor Wolf did present his proposed budget back in February, and it was an extremely aggressive budget that put a lot of focus and emphasis on funding school districts. It is highly unlikely that will get passed, and the state is currently in negotiations now on that final budget process. Ultimately, I think the legislature will approve a budget that is very much more conservative than what the governor proposed. But right now, we have no insight at all into how those conversations are going. On the expenditure side of the ledger, we are working right now on final staffing models for next year, based again on needs, enrollment, scheduling at the high school are driving some of those discussions. We're looking at our healthcare rates. Every 1% reduction is worth about $75,000. So I already talked a little about that tonight. Charter school enrollment, we know that we see students coming back, but it's a total unknown. That could swing one way or another on any given day. And then special education services are really a true unknown. We know the students that are with us today and the programs and services that they need. We don't know if what students, new students coming in, kindergarten, new students that might move in from outside, what types of programs and services they might need. And some of those can be extremely costly. So that's kind of where we are right now in our budget process. So Dr. Yanni, I'll turn it over to you if there's any other questions or for some closing remarks.
Sure, there are a couple questions, and if anyone has any additional questions, now would be the time to put them in the, or type them in. Mr. Leckman, there was a question that, what is the percentage of PSERS that is funded basically by the employee?
So it's different because there's some new tiers that are out there. I will just say the large majority of employees pay their share is 7.5%. There are some new tiers that increase that a little bit, but the vast majority are 7.5%.
There's a question about debt. Sandy Run debt was not voted on, but will additional debt be a voter issue, or does the district have the authority already to issue more debt?
Yep, the district has the school board primarily has the authority to issue more debt. The reason that debt would need voter approval or voter referendum would be that if we cannot fit the new debt into our existing budget, and we would need to increase taxes beyond what the index allows to pay for it. So as long as we can fund it in our current budget, then the school board is authorized to issue debt.
There was a question that came in that said, are we assuming that there will be new students with new developments? And as new developments come in, we want everyone to know that we're tracking the number of students that are enrolling. So far, Promenade, we have, I believe we have one student from Promenade. That's just one example. So as new developments and new housing comes online, we will absolutely be tracking that. There's a question based on the projection deficit chart. Will we need to make cuts, including staff, to fund the $1 million growing to $5 million? The reason that we show that chart is to show the long range planning that we have to do, because our goal is not to impact programs and staff that ultimately negatively impact our students. And so we want to be very careful as we build budgets in the future and we make decisions each year so that we don't put ourselves in a position where we have to cut staff, cut programs, increase taxes above the index. And so I think what people should be, let me say this, what I'm happy about at this point, or not happy about, but what I'm okay with right now, looking at what we're calling our structural deficit at this point in the year. Yes, we still have more work to do, and yes, we have to bring that down, but we're on a good path right now. There have been other years where that structural deficit right now is much higher than it is currently. So we have to keep working on that, because every move that we make to reduce that structural deficit this year positively impacts the out years. So that's why we say the budget work is never really done, right? So when next year's budget is passed in June, work on the following year's budget starts right away. Can you please explain the amount of funding that comes in from the state for charter schools and the actual amount Upper Dublin pays to those charter schools? So there is no funding that comes in from the state anymore for charter schools. There used to be years ago a line in the governor's budget that reimbursed districts for cyber costs. There is no money in the governor's budget, and hasn't been for years. That line has been zeroed out. But Mr. Leckman, can you remind us of the actual costs we pay?
Yes, it's about $18,000 for students that receive regular education services, and $38,000 for students that receive special education services, regardless of the type of services they receive.
There was a question, do the projections include the projected tax increase? Just a reminder that we have a placeholder in of 3% and then 2% in the out years, but those numbers will become more realistic as we go through the next couple of weeks and we continue to work on reducing the expenditure side of the budget. We also have a question about use of the track. Why is the track locked? Why is the community not permitted to use the track? We have a facility use process and a facility rental process for spaces across the district. And so folks that might want to use the track would need to go through that facility facility rental process. I don't see any other questions coming in. So I'll just take a few seconds to thank everyone for joining us this evening. One of the things that we feel really strongly about is we need to be as transparent and explain the budget as clearly as possible so that everyone, our staff, our community, understands how our budget is constructed, what the budget pressures are, where there are things that we can remove from the budget that don't impact students negatively. So we hope you found this evening helpful. The recording of this event will be up online. Typically, it takes 2 or 3 days for the recording to be up on our YouTube channel, but we will absolutely share the link in next week's Touch Base Tuesday. Again, thank you so much for giving of your time to listen to the information that we shared, this evening. You can stay abreast of what's occurring inside the budget development process by joining our finance committee meetings. We meet monthly. Those meetings are on the calendar, and those meetings are also recorded and put up on our YouTube channel. I want to thank Mr. Leckman for his great presentation this evening, and for all of the clarity that he provided around a number of complex topics. Thank you all. Have a great evening.